Halimadat, thank you so very much for joining us in this series of conversation during Mediation Week this year. This year, we are talking about dispute resolution, particularly early dispute resolution and dispute prevention. All of us have looked at the events in the world over the last few years with a sense of dread, perhaps, or anxiety. Coming out of COVID, looking at global inequities, wars, protests, a sense that there has been a fundamental shift in how we are moving forward as a community, a world society, and the stressors in our lives seem to have become even bigger than we imagined pre-COVID. Perhaps that's just in our minds, but it is a reality that many people face every day. And particularly for young people, there is a real sense that the world in which they live has left them behind. The climate anxieties, the sense of frustration with resource allocation is making mental health issues particularly severe in most societies. In the context of that kind of environment, there is sometimes a tendency to feel that the control we have is minuscule. But within our lives, there is great agency. And how we deal with our families and how we deal with our societies and how we deal with our communities sets the prototype for how we show up in the world at large. We are very fortunate that after many, many years of work, we have been able to get to the stage where the guidelines for ethical wealth transfer and inheritance planning met Qudamat Hazrat Imam's approval, and we got permission to release these guidelines to the Jamat earlier this year. These guidelines provide a very solid framework and guidance for people to reflect on what is right for their families, and to have the agency to be able to move forward in that area where we have control. These guidelines build on our ethical values, build on our history, and create a hopeful future. And we hope a hopeful future for our future generations, keeping in mind the issues of equity, fairness, and a sense of stewardship, because wealth has to be stewarded, so that we set our Jamat for success, we set future generations for success, and we reduce the likelihood of conflict. And if there is conflict, early resolution as much as possible. I am very pleased today to have an opportunity for a conversation with two leaders within our Jamat. President Shamira Dost Muhammad is the president of the National Council for Kenya. Sophie Premji is the chair of the Ismaili Tariqa and Religious Education Board for India. I am very pleased to have a conversation with both of them. Welcome to you both around my kitchen tables for a conversation. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you,
I'm going to start with you, President Shamira. These guidelines have been released for the last 6 or 8 months, and I wanted to know just how have these guidelines assisted you, your Jamaat, in dealing with what I portrayed as a complex world at this particular point in time. So tell us a little bit about your experience.
Great. Thank you, Julie, for inviting us to your kitchen table. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the guidelines has really helped. I think right across our jurisdiction, it has created thought yet has created dialogue. And sometimes it's a subject that people don't want to speak about, especially parents don't know how to speak to their children. And we come from a traditional background where, in the past, families assumed that the heirs would be the male, and we used to be large multi generational families. I think over time we've moved to become very nuclear families, much smaller families, and there's a lot more dialogue on the dinner table as well. And this ethical guidelines and inheritance planning that was published, I think it gave Jamaat a lot of comfort to know that Maulana Hazar Imam has viewed it, he's blessed it, that it is rooted in our ethics, in our religion, and it has created dialogue on the table to say what it means to the family. What does it mean to understand who are the vulnerable? What does it mean to identify those that we owe a moral obligation to? So I think it's become an important document, come at a very good time for people to start thinking about the future and to use it as a planning document. It's a great tool indeed.
Uh, Chair Sophie, from a tariqa and religious education point of view, how has this document landed in your inbox, and how has the leadership in India looked at this particular document and framework?
Thank you, Chairman Zuli, for inviting me to this conversation. I think the important thing is to know that these guidelines are based on the ethical principles outlined in the Quran, and which reflect the values of our tariqa. So, especially the values that we talk about, like natural justice, like equity. As we know, according to the ethos of Islam, humanity is created from a single soul. And our Ismaili Imams have always promoted the ethos of connectedness and caring based on the principle of Tawheed or oneness. So, what these guidelines do is they build on our long standing traditions of values, the ethical principles, for concern for the weak, compassion towards the vulnerable, keep being mindful of our responsibilities to those who are dependent on us. With time, the way these ethics play out in daily life changes, and that is where we rely on guidance of the imam of the time. But of course, essentially, those ethics and principles don't change. So it is nice to know that these guidelines provide a framework based on the ethical principles of our tariqa, but at the same time, they provide enough scope for an individual to look at their unique circumstances, their unique contexts, look at the situations from family to family, from individual to individual, and enable the individual to then take informed decisions related to the distribution of their wealth, knowing that this ethical framework is, the basis on which the guidelines have been released. So actually, the leadership was happy in India to receive these. I think what we now need to do is not just generate an awareness in the Jamaat that these guidelines exist, but really, all institutions collaborate and work together to help the Jamaat internalize these guidelines and perhaps empower the Jamaat to think through their unique circumstances to be able to then make these decisions related to wealth distribution.
President Shamira, when we talk about wealth distribution, there is a tendency to think of it only in the context of people passing on and inheritance at the time of death. These guidelines are broader in that context because they're talking about wealth distribution during one's lifetime as well. Has that resonated for the Jamaat in your jurisdiction?
So we have seen quite a number of families coming forward, as you know, working between the National Council and all its portfolio and agencies and working with ICAB and ICRAB. We have trained volunteers, and we have seen that a number of people have actually knocked our doors to say, we'd like to discuss these ethical guidelines. We'd like to understand what it's all about. And we find that it has created thought in people's minds to say, yes, it's more than just about what we will be bequeathing to people, to our families when we pass on. There's a dialogue to be held to say, what do we need to do as a preparation in advance of this inevitable passing away, the death of the head of household or whatever. And it also creates dialogue to say, how are we preparing for everybody in the family, our immediate family, those that, like mentioned, that we have a moral obligation, but also women in the house, the female in the house. I think traditionally families have looked at male heirs, and I think it's opened up new dialogue to say the female is an equal partner, equal person that we need to look at. And we need to provide for that person. If it is younger members of the Jamat or younger members of the family, how are we preparing for them to be strong in their futures, their education, developing their professions and, helping them to stand on their own 2 feet? What does that mean? And those things need to be done before one passes away, making sure that the females in the household are also strong and capable of standing on their own 2 feet. So we do see a lot of people knocking, families coming, discussing it, and we are sort of we've guided them, and we see some changes in their thought processes. And some have even mentioned or said that they would like to change the way they think through this wealth transfer and inheritance planning. So definitely a pre-planning tool for sure.
For sure, yes, and building resilience. Chairman Sophie, with respect to sort of transfer during the lifetime, Alhamdulillah, we're all living very long lives, so we have to be incredibly grateful for that. And a lot of times the inheritance, when you're inheriting something when you're 75 years old, it feels like it's too late in one's life, right? Especially when we're talking about younger generations and younger members of the family. Has there been conversation about transference or assistance during the lifetime for support to secure stable housing, education, all of those kinds of areas of support for younger generations of the family?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question, Chairman Zuli. I think COVID has made us realize that life is uncertain, it's fragile. So it's very important to protect the wealth of a family. In terms of the protection, we've realized that many people still don't have their wills in place. So I think as a starting point, that would be an important thing to do. And this entire notion of not just inheritance, but how does one look at wealth transfer in the course of one's lifetime? As you rightly said, lifespans have increased. If one waits for a bequest, typically the children would be 55, 60 by the time they inherit something, probably too late for them to do much with that. So this notion, I will draw inspiration from Maulana Hazri Imam, who's mentioned that wealth and power are not objectives in themselves, but are to be used in the service of others. And if we go with that kind of approach, I think even something as simple as investing in quality education for our children, we typically don't think of that as wealth transfer. We think of it as an investment, or we think of it as an expense that a family has to bear. But really looking at it this way, that when children are young, we must provide for their quality education, which can stand them in good stead for a lifetime. This can be one way that we transfer our wealth in the course of our lifetimes, giving it to the intended beneficiaries at the right time when they need it most. Looking at a principle like gender parity, for example, caring for families has always been part and parcel of a tradition. But how does that play out in today's world, in today's context, where women are playing important contributory roles in society, be it leadership roles, be it the workforce? Women are also managing the home. So, in light of this changing world scenario, how do then individuals provide for that equal opportunity? And when we say equality or gender parity, it's not apples to apples, but it's really providing equality of opportunity so that both genders can shine, they can achieve their potential, and sort of enable them, empower them to do their best in the course of their lifetimes. The other thing could be, perhaps starting a business. That's another area where people can look at supporting their, intended beneficiaries to take advantage of the wealth transfer in the course of one's lifetime. So while providing sufficiently for oneself, one can think about these things in the course of one's lifetime. And I think another thing we are seeing more and more now is the movement and migration of the Jamaat. Keeping in mind this, in India, we have a lot of couples who are now elderly or seniors who have children who moved on to other countries. Now, if those assets or that wealth needs to be protected from an intergenerational perspective, it may be easier and simpler to think about transfer in the course of one's lifetime. So, these are just some examples to highlight how this can actually be beneficial in terms of protecting the wealth within a family from generation to generation.
Thank you very much, both of you. This has been a very interesting conversation, and it's really nice to see how it's being applied, in actual terms in countries and in jurisdictions across the places where our Jamaat lives. And I've been so inspired by the work that both of you are doing in your jurisdictions. It's been absolutely wonderful to see something that can be, viewed as a document, but it's in the course of its application that it comes to life and has a sense of resilience and building resilience within our Jamaat, particularly at this particular time in our history. So I thank you both very much for your participation at my kitchen table this morning for me and late evening for you. Thank you both very much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Jeannie. Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Nalimadha.
I hope you have found this conversation interesting and helpful for a source of reflection. As we build resilience, part of it is learning from what everyone else is doing around us and taking advantage of resources and opportunities that are in front of us. The guidelines are available for you at the ICAB website. And as we indicated earlier, in every jurisdiction in the world where the Jamaat lives, we have trained volunteers to assist you to understand these guidelines so that you can reflect on how or if these guidelines would be helpful for you. They always depend on your acceptance of them and application of them in your lifetime and in your lives. We hope that this resource will be of assistance to you as we look at a fundamentally changing world and where resilience in our population, resilience for younger generations is, is girded by equity and by a sense of fairness in how they're treated within their families and how they can be expected to be treated in the world at large. It's nice to have a sense of alignment along the way. I've really enjoyed these conversations, and I hope that you do too. Thank you, and Yali Madat.